Princess Anne just invoked emergency protocols suspending Prince Archie's title. The action wasn't announced through press releases or palace statements. It happened through internal palace mechanisms that only activate when the welfare of a minor in the line of succession is considered at immediate risk. And the trigger wasn't scandal or public controversy. It was something considerably more concerning. A complete breakdown in medical oversight and educational accountability that had been developing quietly for months before anyone outside the inner palace circle understood what was happening. This isn't about family drama or publicity disputes. This is about a 7-year-old child who disappeared from every institutional safeguard designed to protect royal minors while adults fought over narratives. And when those safeguards collapsed completely, the palace moved with a speed and decisiveness that has shocked even veteran royal observers. Let's start with what actually triggered the emergency protocols, because understanding the sequence of events that led to this moment is essential to understanding why the response was so immediate and so severe. The first indication that something was wrong didn't come from the palace. It came from educational administrators in California doing something entirely routine, taking attendance. On the final day of January, 2 children enrolled at a private school in Santa Barbara didn't show up for classes. Archie Harrison, Lilibet Diana. Initially, this wasn't alarming. Children miss school, families travel, excuses arrive late. But by midday, something felt wrong to the staff. There had been no notification, no email, no voicemail, no request for leave. And when the office attempted to reach the parent listed as primary contact, there was no response. By late afternoon, the concern escalated when it became clear this wasn't an isolated incident. Another educational facility confirmed the same absence. Another message went unanswered. A welfare liaison flagged the situation internally with a subject line that would later echo through briefings on both sides of the Atlantic. No show, immediate concern. This alone wouldn't have triggered a crisis. Schools see temporary disappearances that resolve themselves. What changed everything was what happened when verification protocols were activated. A routine check was sent through the established liaison channel, connecting the California schools to the UK-based Child Welfare Coordination Team assigned to the Sussex children under the existing custody frameworks. The response window closed without reply. Then the files were examined more carefully. No transfer paperwork had been filed with any educational institution. No forwarding school had been listed. No homeschooling declaration had been submitted to relevant authorities. Medical records showed cancelled appointments with no forwarding provider information. Standing pediatric care relationships had been terminated without explanation or referral. And most concerning of all, no alternative guardian or caretaker had been registered in any of the systems designed to ensure continuity of care for royal minors living abroad. If you're recognizing that what's being described here isn't a temporary absence or a scheduling confusion, but a systematic withdrawal from every institutional safeguard that provides oversight and protection for children in vulnerable situations, subscribe right now and turn on notifications. This story involves mechanisms of royal child protection that most people don't know exist, and understanding how those mechanisms work is essential to understanding why the palace response was so swift and so total. Hit the like button if detailed examination of institutional safeguards is valuable to you. And drop a comment with your perspective on whether the palace was right to intervene or whether this represents overreach into family privacy. The pattern that emerged as palace officials examined the situation more closely wasn't one of chaos or neglect, it was one of deliberate, systematic withdrawal. And that distinction matters enormously in terms of how child welfare professionals assess risk. Neglect is chaotic, it leaves traces. Half-finished paperwork, emotional explanations, confused communications. What the palace was seeing was the opposite. Every action was clean, precise, complete. Systems weren't disrupted through incompetence or oversight. They were deliberately exited through careful planning. Educational ties severed without transition arrangements. Medical continuity cancelled without replacement providers. Communication channels with welfare coordinators blocked through explicit legal instruction rather than passive non-response. Even the court-appointed mediator, who had been facilitating discussions about long-term custody arrangements, received no reply to scheduled meeting requests. The mediation process, which both parties had agreed to participate in under judicial supervision, was simply abandoned without explanation. And then came the detail that transformed concern into alarm. A trust that had been established for the children's education, with cross-jurisdictional oversight involving both UK and US legal frameworks, had been dissolved. Not restructured, not paused. Dissolved entirely, with the funds redirected away from any mechanism connected to institutional oversight. For professionals trained in child welfare assessment, one conclusion became unavoidable. When a caregiver systematically removes a child from education, healthcare, and oversight simultaneously, the issue is no longer parenting style or family privacy. It's risk of what child protection frameworks call institutional disappearance, the removal of a child from every system that provides independent verification of their welfare. And when children connected to the royal line of succession vanish from all formal safeguarding systems at once, the Crown doesn't request explanations through diplomatic channels. It activates emergency protocols. Now, let's examine the specific medical dimension of this crisis. Because while the educational withdrawal was concerning, it was the medical severance that triggered the most serious alarm bells within palace child welfare structures. According to documents reviewed by palace officials, Archie had been under the care of a pediatric practice in Santa Barbara that specialized in developmental monitoring for young children. The practice had established a routine care schedule that included regular wellness checks, developmental assessments, and coordination with specialists when needed. This is standard care for any child, but particularly important for children whose medical history forms part of institutional records that can be reviewed if welfare concerns arise. That entire relationship was terminated in mid-January, with a single notification stating that services were no longer required. No forwarding physician information was provided, no medical records transfer was requested, and most significantly, no explanation was given for why a child in apparently good health would suddenly sever ties with established pediatric care. The practice, bound by patient confidentiality, couldn't share specific details with palace officials. But they could confirm the termination and could note that no forwarding provider had been designated, which is highly unusual in routine pediatric care transitions. When palace welfare coordinators attempted to verify that alternative care had been established, they encountered the same pattern of blocked communication that was emerging across all institutional touchpoints. Legal representatives stated that medical care was a private family matter and declined to provide verification that appropriate care relationships had been established. That refusal created a situation where no independent medical professional could verify Archie's current health status, developmental progress, or access to care. For child welfare professionals, that absence of independent medical verification is a significant red flag, particularly when it occurs simultaneously with educational withdrawal and communication blocking. The medical concern wasn't that Archie was believed to be in immediate physical danger, it was that no one outside the immediate household could verify his welfare, and the systems designed to provide that verification had been systematically dismantled. Palace medical advisors who reviewed the situation noted that the pattern was consistent with what child protection literature describes as isolation, preceding either relocation to avoid oversight or preparation for a lifestyle that can't sustain institutional scrutiny. Neither possibility was acceptable for a child in the line of succession. There's also a historical dimension to the palace's concern about medical oversight that goes beyond this immediate situation. The royal family has long-standing protocols requiring that children in the succession have documented medical care from accredited providers whose records can be verified if questions about health or development arise that affect succession planning. These protocols exist because the line of succession isn't merely a family tree, it's a constitutional mechanism with legal implications for governance. When a child in that line has no verifiable medical oversight, it creates a gap in the documentation that future constitutional questions might require. That constitutional concern, combined with the immediate child welfare concern, to create a situation where the palace concluded that restoration of medical oversight wasn't optional but mandatory. And when attempts to restore that oversight through cooperative channels failed, more assertive mechanisms became necessary. The dental care dimension added another layer of concern. Records showed that scheduled dental appointments for both children had been cancelled in late January, again with no forwarding provider information. Dental care might seem less critical than medical care, but for child welfare professionals, it's another indicator of overall care quality and another potential source of independent verification of a child's welfare. The pattern was the same. Established care relationship terminated, no replacement designated, communication blocked when verification was attempted. Each individual cancellation could be explained away. Taken together, they formed a pattern that child protection frameworks are designed to identify and respond to before harm occurs rather than after. If you're starting to understand why the palace concluded that this situation required immediate intervention rather than continued diplomatic engagement, you're grasping why what happened next was inevitable rather than optional. Subscribe if you haven't already, because the mechanisms that got activated and the consequences that followed represent the most significant assertion of royal authority over child welfare in modern history. Like this video if understanding the institutional frameworks that protect vulnerable children is important to you. And tell me in the comments whether you believe the palace response was proportionate to the situation or whether there were less dramatic options that should have been pursued first. The emergency meeting that followed wasn't scheduled through normal palace procedures. It was summoned by early morning on February 3rd. The classification of the situation had changed from safeguarding anomaly to immediate custodial breach. That shift in language altered everything. In palace protocol, words function as gates. Once passed, there's no casual return to previous frameworks. What had been treated as a concerning pattern was now being handled as an active crisis, requiring immediate intervention. Princess Anne arrived carrying a sealed folder marked for priority review. Those present described the atmosphere as the room went still when the contents were examined. The folder didn't contain speculation or hearsay, it contained verified documentation. Copies of the pediatric care terminations showing standing medical relationships ended without referral to alternative providers. Correspondence logs proving that welfare communications hadn't merely gone unanswered, but had been actively blocked through legal instruction, directing that all contact be routed through attorneys who then didn't respond to the redirected communications. The trust dissolution documents, showing that an education fund originally established under joint oversight had been formally eliminated, with the money transferred to accounts that weren't subject to the cross-jurisdictional accountability mechanisms the original trust required. And communications showing that educational and welfare officials attempting to verify the children's status had been explicitly directed to cease direct contact, with all inquiries to be handled through legal representatives who subsequently provided no substantive information. Princess Anne's assessment, according to sources familiar with the meeting, was direct and unambiguous. This isn't withdrawal from obligation. This is withdrawal from visibility. That characterization reframed the entire crisis, because visibility, in child welfare terms, isn't about publicity or media attention. It's about the existence of independent witnesses who can verify a child's welfare. Children can be shielded from public attention while remaining anchored to institutions that provide oversight. But when every professional system is exited simultaneously, shielding becomes concealment. The room understood the implication. If no school could confirm attendance, if no physician could verify medical care, if no mediator could document contact, then no institution could testify to the children's welfare or development. That vacuum of independent verification wasn't accidental. The pattern suggested it was engineered. One advisor attempted to offer alternative explanations. Perhaps this was temporary relocation, perhaps excessive legal caution, perhaps fear of media exposure following recent publicity. Princess Anne's response reportedly ended that line of discussion. Then why dissolve the trust? The question had no good answer. Educational trusts don't expose children to photographers. Pediatricians don't leak information to tabloids. Court mediators don't sell stories. These systems exist to protect children, not to generate publicity. Their removal signaled motivation that had nothing to do with privacy protection and everything to do with eliminating oversight. As the briefing continued, another dimension emerged that deepened concern. Intelligence assessments indicated that preparations for this withdrawal had been underway for months. Agreements drafted, systems researched. Future plans outlined that made no reference to co-parenting frameworks or shared custody arrangements. The language used in these planning documents was clinical rather than emotional. Maternal autonomy, strategic separation, brand independence. These weren't the communications of a distressed parent seeking to protect children from harm. They were the terminology of a calculated repositioning. Documents obtained through legal discovery and unrelated proceedings showed that as early as November, discussions had been occurring about future projects and initiatives that made no mention of the children, Despite the fact that previous Sussex branding had prominently featured family positioning, the shift from family-centered branding to individual positioning would be unremarkable in most contexts. But when it occurred simultaneously with the systematic withdrawal from all child welfare oversight systems, it suggested a strategic decision to decouple the children from public identity entirely. That decoupling would be a personal choice in a private family. But for children in the line of succession, it represents something different. An attempt to remove them from institutional memory while they're still minors unable to make such decisions for themselves. The palace's concern wasn't that Meghan was making different parenting choices than the institution would prefer. It was that those choices were creating a situation where the children would reach adulthood with no institutional connection, no documented development, and no independent verification of the care and education they received during their childhood years. For children whose future may involve constitutional roles, that absence of institutional documentation creates problems that can't be solved retroactively. You can't recreate years of missing medical records. You can't verify educational development that occurred outside any accredited system. You can't establish identity and competence when there are no independent witnesses to childhood and adolescence. At that point, the palace stopped asking whether intervention would appear heavy-handed. The only remaining question was whether delay would cause irreparable harm to children whose connection to identity, history, and institutional protection was being systematically severed. By the time the briefing reached Prince William, the decision tree had already narrowed to a single path. He was in the middle of a public engagement when the urgent notification reached him. Sources describe him reading the summary file without interruption, then closing it and remaining silent for what those present described as an unusually long moment before speaking. His assessment, according to multiple sources, was, "This is no longer about parental conflict. This is about whether two children are allowed to drift out of institutional memory entirely." That framing transformed the situation from family dispute to institutional emergency. Until that moment, the palace response had been procedural. Safeguards activated, courts notified, files prepared. William's intervention transformed it into command decision-making, with him assuming personal responsibility for the outcome. He asked one question: what happens if we do nothing? The answer was immediate and unanimous. If no action was taken, the children would remain legally traceable through birth records and succession documents, but practically unanchored to any system capable of verifying their welfare, education, or development. Their lives would unfold without institutional oversight. Their identity would become entirely narrative-dependent, subject to future reframing without verification or independent corroboration. That outcome was unacceptable to an institution built on continuity and accountability. The concept of structural guardianship entered the discussion, not symbolic involvement, not advisory oversight. Structural control through legal mechanisms designed for scenarios where the continuity and welfare of minors in the succession are threatened by private actions that remove them from institutional protection. The clause authorizing such intervention hadn't been invoked in living memory. Most of those present had studied it only as constitutional theory, a safeguard designed for extreme circumstances, drafted in response to historical crises, dormant by design until circumstances made its activation necessary. Its purpose was singular: to ensure that no minor connected to the succession could be removed from institutional protection through private action alone, regardless of parental authority. William didn't ask whether activation would be controversial. He asked whether it was lawful and whether it was justified. The answers were yes to both. William's authorization came with a specific directive that shaped everything that followed. The intervention must prioritize the children's long-term welfare over short-term family harmony. If we have to choose between preserving adult relationships and protecting childhood development, we protect the children. That directive eliminated the middle ground compromises that palace officials had been exploring. There would be no negotiated settlement that left the children partially visible to oversight systems. There would be no shared custody arrangement that depended on voluntary cooperation that had already proven unreliable. There would be full restoration of institutional safeguards, or there would be full assumption of guardianship. Nothing in between. The Royal Advisory Council convened at first light to make the formal determination. The briefing was concise and structured. It outlined the verified pattern: education removed, medical oversight severed, welfare communication blocked, identity references systematically eliminated, financial safeguards dismantled. The conclusion was unanimous. The threshold for emergency guardianship had been met. What followed wasn't symbolic. It was the Crown assuming direct responsibility for stabilizing lives at documented risk of institutional disappearance. The first directive took immediate effect. International travel authority for the children was suspended pending dual authorization from Princess Anne and the Crown's Child Welfare Council. This wasn't framed as restriction, but as protection, preventing untraceable relocation while legal frameworks were stabilized. The practical implementation of this directive involved coordination with immigration authorities in both the United States and United Kingdom. Passport records were flagged, border systems were updated. The children could not be removed from their current jurisdiction without explicit Crown approval, which would only be granted after verification that appropriate safeguards existed at any proposed destination. This wasn't house arrest or confinement. The children remained free to live normal lives within their current location, but they could not be relocated internationally in ways that would make oversight more difficult or impossible. The second directive addressed commercial exploitation. All usage of the children's names, likenesses, or implied royal association was frozen under privacy statutes designed to shield minors from monetization. The children were removed entirely from commercial space. Their identities were placed beyond brand strategy. This had immediate practical effects. Any existing licensing agreements that referenced the children were placed under review. Any planned projects that involved their names or images were halted. Any merchandise or media that traded on their royal connection faced potential legal action under privacy protections that the palace was now actively enforcing. The message to commercial entities was clear. These children are no longer available for brand purposes, and any attempt to use their identities commercially will face full legal opposition from Crown resources. The third action established a restoration trust under Crown oversight, funded to ensure long-term educational stability, medical care, and psychological support. The trust wasn't discretionary. It was structured to outlast media cycles and personal conflicts, with a mandate focused on stability rather than optics. The trust was capitalized with palace funds specifically allocated for this purpose, ensuring that the children's welfare needs would be met regardless of parental financial situations or commercial success. Educational costs, medical expenses, therapeutic support, and developmental programs would all be covered through institutional resources, rather than depending on parental income. Trustees were appointed with specific expertise in child development, educational planning, and trauma-informed care. Their mandate was to ensure that the children received everything they needed to develop healthily and to maintain connection to their heritage and identity, even if parental cooperation was limited or absent. And the fourth action, the one that has generated the most attention, formal suspension of Prince Archie's courtesy title pending resolution of custody frameworks that provide adequate safeguarding. This wasn't punishment. It was removal of a designation that carries institutional obligations while the child was in a situation where those obligations couldn't be fulfilled because no institution could verify his welfare or development. The title Prince isn't merely honorific. It comes with constitutional implications, security requirements, and institutional responsibilities. When a child bearing that title is invisible to the systems designed to support and oversee royal minors, the title becomes problematic rather than protective. The suspension was framed as temporary, contingent on restoration of appropriate safeguarding frameworks, but it sent an unmistakable message. Royal titles are not unconditional. They come with expectations of institutional connection and oversight. When that connection is severed, the title itself becomes subject to review. Subscribe for continued coverage as the long-term implications of this intervention become clear and as the legal frameworks governing the children's futures get formalized. Like this video if you believe institutional protection of vulnerable children should take precedence over parental autonomy when those children are at risk of disappearing from all oversight systems. And share your perspective in the comments on whether the Crown's actions represent necessary intervention or whether this crosses lines that shouldn't be crossed, even in crisis situations. The palace doesn't announce these actions through press conferences. They're executed through administrative channels that legal professionals and child welfare authorities understand, even when the general public doesn't. But the consequences were immediate. Financial networks flagged accounts associated with Sussex commercial ventures, seeking verification of compliance with new restrictions on use of Royal Connection. Licensing agreements were paused pending legal review. Platforms adjusted metadata, removing references that were no longer authorized. Legal teams shifted from assertion to defense. Within days, communications ceased flowing from the Sussex side. There were no counter-briefings, no emotional appeals, no reconciliation overtures. Legal counsel issued a single carefully worded response invoking privacy and jurisdictional disagreement. It changed nothing. The core determination had been made through mechanisms that don't depend on agreement or cooperation. The Crown had acted under authority that exists independently of parental consent. And once that authority is invoked, reversal requires meeting the same threshold that triggered intervention: restoration of adequate safeguarding. For Meghan, the isolation was total. Media partners recalibrated their relationships overnight. Projects that had been in development were quietly shelved. References that had been prominent in promotional materials disappeared. The phrase circulating privately among industry professionals was reputational risk. This wasn't coordinated attack or orchestrated pressure. It was rational commercial decision-making. When the Crown publicly signals through formal action that a particular individual's judgment regarding child welfare is so flawed that emergency intervention was required, commercial entities reassess the wisdom of association. Harry's attempts at intervention came too late and were hampered by the same structural issues that had contributed to the crisis. Requests for temporary access were reviewed and denied on technical grounds. Travel limitations created by his own visa status, uncertainties, housing instability given the lack of permanent UK residence, absence of independent infrastructure capable of supporting shared custody given his dependence on family resources he was now in conflict with. Each obstacle alone might have been manageable through negotiation and compromise. Together, they created a situation where Harry couldn't demonstrate that he could provide the stable, overseen environment that the palace was requiring as a condition for restored contact. A formal communication was delivered through secure channels. Its language was precise and final. Guardianship now falls under Crown protocol. Further conditions for contact will be communicated if appropriate. The phrase "if appropriate" carried weight. It wasn't when appropriate or as soon as appropriate. It was if appropriate, acknowledging the possibility that circumstances might not support restored contact on any timeline that could be currently projected. Inside Windsor, attention shifted to what it always does after crisis intervention: repair. Educational plans were re-established with accredited institutions that provided appropriate developmental support and maintained proper records. Medical continuity was resumed with pediatric providers who specialized in complex family situations and who understood the importance of maintaining detailed documentation. Emotional support frameworks were expanded, with professionals specializing in identity disruption, parental conflict, and transatlantic displacement brought in under long-term mandate. This wasn't crisis counseling designed to address immediate trauma. This was developmental support, designed to continue for years, helping the children process their situation and build healthy identity in circumstances no child should have to navigate. The children were reintegrated into routines governed by predictability rather than crisis. School attendance was logged and monitored. Developmental progress was documented through standard assessments. Medical care was provided and recorded. Independent witnesses were restored to their lives. That restoration of witness mattered more than any public narrative or media coverage, because witness is protection. When multiple independent professionals can verify that a child is safe, developing appropriately, and receiving adequate care, that child has protection that doesn't depend on any single adult's choices or character. The palace's position throughout has been that this intervention was about restoring those witnesses, not about punishing adults or asserting institutional control for its own sake. Whether that characterization is accepted or rejected by observers depends on their prior beliefs about royal authority and parental rights. But the legal and institutional reality is clear. The Crown determined that the threshold for emergency intervention had been met, activated mechanisms that exist precisely for such circumstances, and implemented a guardianship framework designed to ensure that two children don't reach adulthood without verifiable connection to their heritage, their development, and their identity. The consequences will unfold over years, not weeks. These children will grow up under a framework none of them chose, shaped by decisions adults made in conflict they didn't create. The institutional mechanisms activated will remain in place until the children reach majority and can make their own decisions about identity, connection, and relationship. Whether history judges this intervention as necessary protection or excessive control will depend on outcomes that can't yet be measured. Whether the children thrive or struggle, whether their development is supported or damaged, whether their eventual adult perspectives validate or reject the institutional choices made on their behalf when they were too young to have voices in the process. What's certain is that a line has been crossed that hasn't been crossed in modern royal history. The Crown has asserted authority over children in ways that override parental wishes based on determinations about child welfare that are institutionally grounded but personally devastating. Because what happened here will be studied for years, as either the moment the monarchy demonstrated it still takes child protection seriously enough to act decisively, or as an overreach that damaged family relationships beyond repair in pursuit of institutional control. The palace has made its position clear through action rather than words. The children are no longer subjects of speculation, they're wards of continuity. And the Crown, having determined intervention was necessary, isn't seeking validation or approval. It's ensuring that two lives don't drift into silence while adults argue about narratives. The mechanisms are in place, the safeguards are restored, and whatever happens next will unfold within frameworks designed to prioritize childhood development over adult conflict. Stay informed. This is institutional child protection operating at the highest level of authority, with stakes that extend beyond any individual family into questions about how institutions balance protection and autonomy when the two come into irreconcilable conflict.